Something is happening right now, and the reason you feel restless, distracted, and uneasy is because your instincts are picking up on a shift that hasn't been explained to you. People keep saying things are fine, that this is just how the world is now, but deep down, that's not true. The rules are changing, the pressure is increasing, and systems that once felt stable are quietly tightening all at once. And the most dangerous part is that it's happening without a headline, without a vote, and without anyone being asked if this is what they want. Control today doesn't arrive with sirens and speeches. It arrives disguised as updates, safety measures, and necessary adjustments that no one is supposed to question. Look around and ask yourself an honest question. Why does everything suddenly feel more restricted, more monitored, more conditional? Why do people hesitate before speaking? Why do conversations stop short? Why does it feel like stepping out of line carries consequences even when no rule has been clearly broken? That feeling isn't paranoia, it's pattern recognition. You're watching a system shift from freedom as a default to permission as a requirement. You're still allowed to do things, but only as long as you stay within invisible boundaries that can move at any moment. This is how it always starts, not with force, but with normalization. Small changes introduced one by one, each easy to justify on its own, each framed as common sense, each defended by people who believe they're being responsible, and before anyone realizes it, the landscape has changed completely. What would have triggered outrage years ago now barely registers. People adapt because adaptation feels easier than resistance. They tell themselves it's temporary, necessary, or unavoidable. And that's exactly what the system is counting on. What's happening right now isn't chaos, it's coordination. Multiple systems tightening at the same time, reinforcing each other, limiting options without ever saying the word limit. Access becomes conditional, visibility becomes selective. Consequences appear without explanation. And when people ask questions, they're told not to worry, not to speculate, not to overthink it. Distraction becomes the anesthetic. As long as people are entertained, outraged at each other, or overwhelmed, they won't notice the bigger picture taking shape around them. This is why exhaustion is such a powerful tool. A tired population doesn't push back. It copes, it scrolls, it adapts. When people are overloaded with information and stress, they lose the energy to question deeper structures. They focus on surviving the day instead of understanding the system. And while they're busy managing their own anxiety, the framework around them keeps shifting quietly, efficiently, and without resistance. The most infuriating part is that none of this requires people to agree. It only requires them to stop paying attention. The system doesn't need loyalty, it needs apathy. It needs people to assume someone else is watching, someone else is responsible, someone else will speak up. And as long as that assumption holds, the changes continue uninterrupted. That uneasy feeling you have is your warning signal. It's the sense that something fundamental is being altered while you're being encouraged to look away. This moment isn't about panic, it's about awareness. Because once you notice the pattern, once you admit to yourself that this didn't happen by accident, you can't go back to sleep. And that's the one thing they're hoping you won't do. The biggest mistake people make is expecting control to look the way it used to, because if it did, everyone would recognize it immediately. That's why it had to evolve. Control today doesn't come with uniforms, speeches, or obvious threats. It comes wrapped in language that sounds reasonable, even comforting. It's called safety, moderation, optimization, compliance, responsibility. Words that feel neutral, even positive, until you realize they're being used to justify the same outcome everywhere. Limitation, not limitation enforced by force, but limitation accepted voluntarily. That's the upgrade. That's the trick. What you're watching right now is the shift from freedom as a right to freedom as a conditional privilege. You're still told you're free, but that freedom only exists inside invisible guardrails that you're never allowed to see clearly. Step too close to the edge and consequences appear quietly, efficiently, without explanation. Access changes, visibility drops, opportunities disappear. And because there's no clear rule broken, no direct accusation made, people don't know how to fight back. Uncertainty becomes the weapon. When rules are vague, compliance skyrockets. This system works because it doesn't need to punish everyone. It only needs to punish a few, just enough for everyone else to learn the lesson. People watch what happens to those who step out of line, and they adjust their behavior instantly. No announcement required. Fear spreads faster when it's implied instead of declared, and once fear is internalized, the system no longer needs to enforce anything. People enforce it themselves. What makes this even more dangerous is that it's being sold as progress. You're told things are being streamlined, made safer, made more efficient. You're told restriction equals protection, that oversight equals care. And anyone who questions this framing is painted as irresponsible or unstable. That social pressure is critical because it turns the public into the enforcement arm. Authority steps back, invisible, while people police each other. Control becomes decentralized, but power remains centralized. Notice how fast people defend systems that limit them. That's not strength, that's conditioning. When survival, income, communication, and social existence all depend on staying in good standing with centralized platforms and structures, resistance feels dangerous. So people rationalize. They say it's necessary. They say it's temporary. They say it's for the greater good. And every time they say that, the boundaries move again. This is why nothing feels solid anymore. The rules aren't stable because instability benefits control. When people don't know where the line is, they stay far away from it. They self-censor. They overcorrect. They play it safe. And safety becomes obedience disguised as intelligence. The system doesn't want you angry. It wants you cautious. It wants you constantly adjusting, constantly guessing, constantly afraid of making the wrong move. And here's the part they don't want you thinking about. If all of these changes were truly in your interest, they wouldn't need to be introduced quietly. They wouldn't need to be vague. They wouldn't need to punish questions. Transparency would be the rule, not the exception. But transparency threatens control because once people see the structure clearly, they start asking why it exists at all. Control today doesn't shout. It whispers, it nudges, it waits for exhaustion to do the heavy lifting. And by the time people realize how much ground they've lost, the system is already normalized. That's why noticing this now matters. Because once control stops needing to justify itself, reversing it becomes exponentially harder. At some point, people start noticing that certain voices don't get argued with anymore, they just vanish. One day they're visible, widely shared, part of the conversation, and the next day their reach collapses. Their audience can't find them, and no clear explanation is ever given. There's no dramatic takedown, no public confrontation, no clear charge, just vague language about guidelines, standards, or policy changes that never seem to apply evenly. This isn't coincidence, and it isn't random, it's filtration. And filtration is far more effective than outright bans because most people don't even realize it's happening. The system has learned that silencing ideas openly creates backlash. It creates martyrs. It draws attention. So instead, it buries. It slows distribution. It limits visibility. It removes momentum. Ideas aren't defeated. They're starved. And when people can't find something easily, they assume it isn't important, or worse, that they're alone in thinking it. Isolation is one of the most powerful tools of control. If people believe they're the only ones questioning what's happening, they're far less likely to speak up. What makes this even more effective is the uncertainty. The rules are never fully explained. They shift constantly. That keeps everyone guessing. When you don't know exactly what crosses the line, you stay well away from it. You soften your language. You avoid certain topics. You second guess yourself before speaking. And just like that, censorship doesn't need to be enforced. It becomes self-inflicted. People learn to censor themselves because the risk feels too high and the consequences too unclear. This creates a chilling effect across society. You don't need to silence everyone. You only need to make examples out of a few. Others will adjust automatically. They'll say, I don't agree with that person, but, and then stay quiet anyway. Fear doesn't care about agreement. Fear cares about survival. And when survival feels tied to visibility, reputation, and access, silence becomes a strategy. At the same time, the illusion of openness is maintained. Platforms still appear busy. Opinions still fly. Debates still rage. But look closely and you'll notice something important. The arguments happen within a very narrow range. People fight each other, but they never threaten the underlying structure. The system doesn't mind disagreement. It thrives on it as long as it stays contained. Real challenges don't get debated. They get buried. And then comes the gaslighting. When people point out that voices are disappearing, they're told it's not happening, or that it's deserved, or that it's exaggerated. The burden of proof is placed on the person noticing the pattern, not on the system creating it. That's intentional. It makes people doubt their own perception. And once people doubt themselves, they stop trusting their instincts altogether. This is how a society moves from open debate to managed conversation without ever announcing the change. People don't realize what they've lost because they're distracted by noise, division, and constant emotional stimulation. By the time the silence becomes obvious, it's already normalized. Independent voices aren't disappearing because they're wrong. They're disappearing because unpredictability threatens systems built on control. A predictable population is easy to manage. An unpredictable one asks questions, connects dots, and refuses to stay in approved lanes. And that's exactly why those voices have to fade quietly, because arguing with them would only draw attention to what the system is trying desperately to hide. This is where the psychological side of the operation becomes impossible to ignore, because control doesn't work on an alert, focused population. It works on an exhausted one. Look at the pace of life right now. Constant outrage cycles, endless emergencies, nonstop noise. People are emotionally drained, mentally overloaded, and permanently distracted, and that's not an accident. A tired population doesn't organize, doesn't investigate, and doesn't push back. It copes, it scrolls, it reacts, and reaction is exactly what the system wants, because reaction keeps people trapped at the surface while deeper structures go unexamined. Division is the fuel. When people are turned against each other, they stop looking up. Every issue is framed as a fight between sides, identities, or tribes, while the same centralized systems quietly tighten control over everyone involved. The public is encouraged to argue endlessly over surface differences, convinced they're fighting for something important, while the real power structures remain untouched. A divided population is easy to manage because it burns all its energy internally. The system doesn't need to suppress resistance when resistance is redirected sideways. Distraction completes the cycle. When attention is constantly hijacked, there is no space left for reflection. People jump from crisis to crisis, headline to headline, never given time to connect patterns or ask long-term questions. The mind becomes reactive instead of analytical, emotional instead of strategic. And when people are locked in emotional response mode, they're far easier to steer. Fear, anger, and outrage override reason, and decisions made under emotional pressure are rarely questioned later. Exhaustion also lowers standards. When people are overwhelmed, they stop demanding clarity, vague explanations become acceptable, contradictions are ignored, inconsistencies are brushed aside. The system doesn't need to convince anyone of everything, it just needs people too tired to care. Compliance grows, not because people agree, but because they lack the energy to resist. Survival mode replaces critical thinking. This is why the pressure never lets up. Relief would allow reflection, and reflection leads to awareness. Instead, stress is normalized. Anxiety is treated as a personal issue rather than a systemic one. People blame themselves for feeling overwhelmed, unaware that overload is being used as a management tool. When individuals internalize the pressure, the system escapes accountability. And notice how questioning this dynamic is framed. Anyone who points out exhaustion, manipulation, or division is accused of spreading negativity or fear. The irony is staggering. The system creates the pressure, then condemns those who name it. That reversal keeps people doubting themselves and distrusting their instincts. Once self-doubt sets in, control tightens effortlessly. This strategy has one goal: keep people too busy surviving to notice what's being built around them. Because once people slow down enough to observe, the pattern becomes obvious. Distraction collapses. Division loses its grip. And the system's greatest weapon, your exhaustion, stops working. That's why awareness is treated as a threat, not outrage, not opposition, awareness. Because the moment people recognize how tired, distracted, and divided they've been made, the spell starts to break. And when that happens, control no longer feels invisible. It feels deliberate. And deliberate control cannot survive long once it's clearly seen. This is the point where people finally realize something fundamental has changed. Even if they don't yet have the language to describe it, freedom hasn't been taken away in one dramatic moment. It's been redefined quietly, carefully, step by step. You're still told you're free, but that freedom now exists only as long as you stay within approved limits that you never agreed to and are never clearly shown. The moment you step outside those limits, consequences appear without explanation. Not legal consequences, not criminal charges, just loss. Loss of access, loss of visibility, loss of opportunity. And that kind of punishment is far more effective than force because it feels personal and isolating. This is how freedom becomes permission. You're allowed to speak as long as what you say fits within acceptable parameters. You're allowed to work as long as you don't disrupt the system. You're allowed to participate as long as you don't question too deeply. The illusion of freedom remains intact because nothing is officially banned. But unofficially, the cost of stepping out of line becomes so high that most people never try. They learn the boundaries instinctively through observation, through fear, through watching what happens to others. What's truly dangerous about this phase is how quickly people adapt to it. They start modifying their language, softening their opinions, avoiding certain subjects altogether, not because they've changed their minds, but because survival feels more important than honesty. Self-censorship becomes second nature. People don't even notice when they stop thinking freely. They just feel relieved that nothing bad happened today. And relief becomes the reward for obedience. The system thrives on this quiet adaptation. It doesn't need everyone to agree. It just needs enough people to comply and enough others to stay silent. Debate still exists, but it's carefully contained. People argue passionately within narrow lanes, convinced they're exercising freedom, while the deeper structure remains untouched. That's the brilliance of it. Noise replaces challenge. Conflict replaces clarity. And the system tightens its grip without ever appearing oppressive. This transformation is always justified as necessary for safety, necessary for stability, necessary for order. Anyone who questions the necessity is accused of being reckless or selfish. That framing is intentional. It turns compliance into virtue and resistance into immaturity. Once morality is attached to obedience, control becomes emotionally enforced. People begin to shame each other into silence, doing the system's work for it. And here's the part no one wants to admit. Once freedom becomes permission, it can be revoked at any time. If access is conditional, it's fragile. If participation depends on approval, it's temporary. People live under the constant pressure of losing what they rely on, and that pressure shapes behavior more effectively than any law ever could. Fear becomes ambient, always present, rarely acknowledged. This is the tipping point, because once people accept permission-based freedom as normal, reversing it becomes incredibly difficult. The memory of genuine freedom fades. Younger generations grow up never knowing anything else. And the system locks itself into place, not through force, but through normalization. But normalization only works when people stop noticing. The moment someone recognizes that freedom has quietly been replaced with permission, the spell weakens. Awareness creates friction, and friction is the one thing this system cannot tolerate for long. Here's what it all comes down to. And this is the part they never want you to fully understand. For all their systems, rules, pressure, and psychological manipulation, there is one thing they cannot control unless you hand it over your awareness. Everything you've seen up to this point depends on people staying distracted, exhausted, divided, and uncertain. The moment you slow down and start noticing patterns instead of reacting to headlines, the entire structure begins to weaken. Control doesn't collapse because people get angry. It collapses because people become conscious. This is why the system works so hard to keep you emotional instead of observant. Outrage burns fast and burns out. Fear paralyzes. Distraction scatters attention. But awareness does the opposite. Awareness connects dots. Awareness restores perspective. And perspective makes manipulation visible. Once something is visible, it can't operate the same way anymore. The illusion depends on invisibility. The moment you see it clearly, it loses leverage. That's why they don't want you calm. They don't want you thinking long term. They don't want you stepping back and asking simple questions like, who benefits from this? Why does everything move in the same direction? Why are the consequences always one-sided? Why is questioning treated like danger? Those questions don't require secret knowledge or special access. They require attention, and attention is the one resource they can't manufacture for you. This isn't about overthrowing anything or confronting anyone head on. That's a trap. The real shift happens internally. When people stop accepting explanations that don't explain, when they stop adapting automatically, when they stop assuming that silence equals safety, the system relies on reflex. Awareness interrupts reflex. Once reflex is broken, behavior changes naturally. People speak more carefully. They choose more deliberately. They stop playing roles they never agreed to. And here's the quiet truth. Awareness spreads, not through shouting, but through example. When one person stops reacting predictably, it affects conversations. When conversations change, assumptions are questioned. When assumptions weaken, narratives lose authority. History doesn't change because everyone wakes up at once. It changes because enough people stop sleeping. This is why they work so hard to make you feel alone when you question things. Isolation keeps awareness from spreading, but you're not alone. You never were. The sense that something is wrong isn't rare, it's common. It's just rarely validated. The moment people realize that others feel the same tension, the same unease, the same pressure, the illusion of consensus cracks. And that's the real end game here. Not control through force, but control through silence and doubt. Once you stop doubting your own perception, the system has to work harder. Once enough people do that, it has to reveal itself more openly. And open control is far weaker than invisible control. So this isn't a call to panic. Panic feeds the machine. This is a call to pay attention, to notice patterns, to trust your instincts without letting them be hijacked by fear. Because the one thing they never plan for and never can is a population that sees clearly, thinks independently, and refuses to stop noticing what's right in front of them. That's the line they don't want crossed. And once it is, everything changes.